The most dangerous assumption humanity has ever been taught is not about politics, religion, or history. It is the idea that space is empty. This single belief quietly shaped how humans understand existence, reality, and their own place in the universe. When space is described as a lifeless vacuum, it becomes irrelevant, harmless, inert, something you pass through, not something you exist within. And once that assumption is accepted, no further questions are asked. Empty space ends curiosity. It closes the door. But assumptions are not truths. They are agreements. And this one has consequences far beyond astronomy. If space is truly empty, then everything meaningful must happen only on planets, inside matter, inside brains. Consciousness becomes an accident. Life becomes isolated. Humanity becomes alone in a dead universe. That story feels comforting because it places humans at the center of meaning while keeping the surrounding reality quiet and manageable. Yet that comfort should raise suspicion, because nature rarely operates through emptiness. Fields, forces, waves, and interactions exist everywhere we look more closely. Gravity crosses space without touching matter. Light travels through it. Quantum effects ignore distance altogether. Even mainstream science now speaks of vacuum energy, quantum fields, and dark forces, all acknowledging activity where emptiness was once assumed. But the deeper implication is carefully avoided. If space is not empty, then humanity is not floating in nothingness. We are immersed in something, and immersion changes everything. It means space is not a background, it is an environment. And environments influence what exists within them. This is where the assumption becomes dangerous, because once space is framed as empty, it can no longer be seen as interactive, responsive, or influential. It becomes invisible by definition, and what cannot be seen cannot be questioned, feared, or respected. Entire civilizations can live inside something powerful without recognizing its presence. Ancient cultures did not share this assumption. They spoke of ether, breath, spirit, fields, and cosmic substance. They described the heavens as alive, structured, and ordered. These ideas were dismissed as primitive not because they were disproven, but because they did not fit a material framework that required separation and control. Declaring space empty removed mystery. And mystery is hard to manage. The warning here is not mystical, it is logical. If space is active rather than empty, then it may store information, transmit influence, or shape perception. That possibility alone would redefine reality. It would mean that what humans call physical is only one layer of a much deeper system. And systems that shape perception are far more powerful than those that shape behavior. The most unsettling realization is this: labeling space as empty may not have been an innocent mistake. It may have been the most efficient way to ensure humanity never asks the most dangerous question of all: what are we actually inside? Because once you admit that space is not empty, you must confront the possibility that it is structured, dynamic, and possibly participatory. And once that door opens, the universe stops being a stage and starts being a system, one that humanity did not design, does not control, and barely understands. This chapter is not telling you what space is. It is removing what space is not. And what remains after that removal is deeply uncomfortable, because emptiness kept humanity psychologically safe. Presence does not. If space is not empty, then the greatest lie was never about stars or galaxies. It was about convincing humanity that nothing surrounds them. And that lie may have kept us calm while keeping us blind. Long before modern science declared space a vacuum, ancient civilizations across the world described it as alive, active, and filled with substance. Not metaphorically alive, but functionally alive, something that moved, carried influence, and connected all things. From the concept of ether in ancient Greece and India, to the Egyptian belief in the duat, to indigenous descriptions of a living sky, space was never treated as empty. It was treated as a medium, a presence, a force that mattered. What is striking is not that these cultures lacked modern instruments, but that they shared remarkably similar descriptions despite being separated by geography and time. They spoke of an invisible substance that permeated everything, transmitting energy, intention, and order. This was not superstition in the way it is often portrayed today. It was observational language, an attempt to describe effects that were felt, measured through experience, and integrated into daily life. Ancient builders aligned structures with stars and celestial movements with extreme precision. Calendars track cosmic cycles with accuracy that still puzzles modern researchers. Rituals were timed to astronomical events, not symbolically but functionally. These civilizations behaved as if space exerted influence, as if alignment mattered because something real was being interacted with. That behavior makes little sense if space were truly empty. The dismissal of these ideas as myth reveals more about modern bias than ancient ignorance. Declaring space dead and empty allowed modern thought to separate humanity from the cosmos. Once separated, the universe became a resource rather than a relationship. Control replaced reverence. Measurement replaced participation. And what could not be measured immediately was labeled imaginary. But ancient cultures were not guessing blindly. They were working within a worldview where consciousness and environment were not separate. They understood that space was not just out there, but something humans existed within and were influenced by. Their language may sound symbolic to modern ears, but symbols often emerge when reality is too complex for rigid terminology. What makes this chapter unsettling is the pattern of erasure. As material science advanced, the concept of ether was not disproven, it was abandoned, declared unnecessary, too inconvenient, too disruptive to a model that required emptiness to function cleanly. Once space was labeled a vacuum, the conversation ended. Inquiry stopped, and with it, an entire dimension of understanding was quietly removed. This removal had consequences. Once space was empty, it could no longer be a carrier of information or influence. Consciousness had to be trapped inside brains. Reality had to be local, linear, and mechanical. Anything suggesting deeper connection was pushed to the margins as philosophy or spirituality safely disconnected from real science. Yet today, modern physics finds itself circling back. Quantum fields, zero-point energy, dark energy, non-locality. Each discovery whispers the same uncomfortable message. Space behaves like a medium, like something structured, like something present. Science is rediscovering what ancient cultures never forgot, but without the language to admit what that implies. This is where the warning sharpens. If ancient civilizations understood space as alive, and modern civilization was taught it was empty, then the shift was not neutral. It reshaped how humanity sees itself, its power, and its limitations. Forgetting a living universe makes control easier. Remembering it makes control fragile. The question is no longer whether ancient cultures were wrong. The question is why their shared understanding was so thoroughly discarded. Because if space was always alive, then the lie was not ancient myth. The lie was modern certainty, and that lie may be ending. What makes the idea that space is not empty truly unsettling is that modern science did not disprove ancient knowledge, it quietly circled back to it without intending to, without announcing it publicly. Science has stumbled into the same conclusion using different language. Quantum fields, vacuum energy, dark energy, 0-point fluctuations all point to the same uncomfortable reality. Space behaves like something, not nothing. The vacuum is not a void. It is seething with activity, potential, and structure. At the quantum level, empty space is anything but empty. Particles appear and disappear spontaneously. Energy exists even at absolute zero. Fields stretch across the universe, influencing matter without physical contact. Experiments demonstrate non-local behavior, where information appears to travel instantaneously across distance, defying classical assumptions. These are not fringe ideas, they are accepted observations. Yet their implications are carefully contained. The problem is not the data, it is the interpretation. A universe filled with active fields suggests that space itself participates in reality. It is not merely a backdrop for events, it is part of the event. This is where modern science hesitates. Because once space is acknowledged as a medium, questions emerge that destabilize long-held assumptions about locality, separation, and control. Physics continues to describe these phenomena in abstract terms, equations, probabilities, models, while avoiding philosophical or existential conclusions. The language remains technical, compartmentalized. The deeper meaning is kept out of public conversation, not because it is false, but because it is disruptive. Dark energy is one of the most telling examples. Scientists admit it makes up the majority of the universe, yet openly confess they do not know what it is. Something fills space, exerts pressure, shapes cosmic expansion, and remains largely unexplained. Calling it dark does not clarify it. It merely postpones understanding, naming, replaces knowing. This is where the rediscovery becomes dangerous. When science encounters something it cannot fully explain, it usually expands inquiry. But when that something threatens the foundational assumption of emptiness, inquiry slows. The subject becomes technical, isolated, inaccessible to public imagination. The message remains clear. Don't ask what this means, only ask how to calculate it. Ancient cultures would have recognized this behavior immediately. They did not separate knowledge from meaning. If space influenced life, then life responded to space. Alignment mattered, cycles mattered, consciousness mattered. Modern science, by contrast, treats consciousness as an afterthought, an accident inside a biological machine, because admitting otherwise would collapse the wall between observer and environment. And yet the evidence keeps pushing back. Quantum observation affects outcome, measurement changes behavior, the observer cannot be removed from the experiment. This alone should have forced a reconsideration of consciousness. Instead, it was reframed as paradox, mystery, something to be worked around rather than confronted. This chapter is unsettling because it reveals a pattern of avoidance. Science has rediscovered the presence in space, but refuses to name it as such. It circles the truth mathematically while avoiding it philosophically. The result is a universe that behaves like an ancient system, described with modern equations, but stripped of meaning. The warning here is not about science being wrong. It is about science being incomplete by design. When knowledge becomes fragmented, dangerous ideas can be isolated before they connect. And the idea that space is alive, structured, or informational is one of the most dangerous ideas of all, because it dissolves the illusion of separation. If space is active, then humanity does not merely occupy the universe. It participates in it. And participation changes responsibility. That realization is why this rediscovery feels accidental rather than celebrated. Because once it is fully acknowledged, the old story of a dead universe collapses, and what replaces it is something far more unsettling. If space is not empty but active, structured, and filled with fields of information, then one assumption collapses immediately: the idea that consciousness is produced solely inside the human brain. This is where the subject stops being theoretical and becomes deeply unsettling. Because if space itself is a medium, then the brain may not generate consciousness at all. It may receive it, filter it, or tune into it, much like a radio interacts with invisible frequencies it did not create. This possibility explains anomalies that material explanations struggle to contain. Consciousness does not behave like matter. It does not occupy a location. It cannot be weighed. It does not diminish when shared. And it cannot be reduced to chemistry without leaving large gaps in understanding. If consciousness were purely local, purely biological, then experience would be sealed inside the skull. Yet evidence suggests otherwise, from intuition and collective emotion to non-local perception and instantaneous knowing. Modern neuroscience observes correlation, not causation. Brain activity accompanies experience, but accompaniment is not origin. Damaging a radio affects the music, but it does not prove the radio created the broadcast. Likewise, altering the brain alters perception, but that does not mean the brain is the source. It may be the interface. If space carries information as quantum fields and non-local phenomena suggest, then consciousness could be embedded in that informational field rather than trapped inside biology. This would mean humans are immersed in consciousness, not isolated from it. And that changes everything. It reframes identity, individuality, and control at the deepest level. This idea is dangerous because it removes ownership of consciousness from institutions, systems, and narratives. If consciousness is not local, it cannot be fully controlled through physical means alone. Shaping perception becomes more important than shaping environment. Managing belief becomes more powerful than managing behavior. And suddenly, the real battlefield is not territory, it is awareness. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They treated mind, space, and cosmos as interconnected. Consciousness was not something you had, it was something you participated in. Modern thinking, by contrast, isolates consciousness inside flesh, making it fragile, accidental, and easy to dismiss. A consciousness confined to biology can be medicated, modified, categorized, and managed. A consciousness embedded in space cannot. This may explain why the idea of non-local consciousness is ridiculed rather than debated. It threatens the foundational narrative of separation. If humans are receivers rather than generators, then individuality becomes contextual rather than absolute. Connection becomes fundamental rather than optional. And the illusion of total isolation dissolves. The warning here is subtle but severe. If space is active and consciousness is non-local, then influence flows both ways. Humanity does not just observe the universe, it interacts with it. Thoughts, attention, and awareness may matter far more than we are taught. And that possibility introduces responsibility rather than comfort. This is not about mysticism, it is about coherence. A universe filled with active fields cannot logically contain consciousness as a disconnected accident. Something this consistent suggests design, structure, or at least systemic behavior. And systems do not ignore participation. If consciousness is non-local, then controlling humanity becomes a matter of narrowing perception rather than restricting movement. Keeping awareness fragmented becomes essential. Distraction becomes a defense mechanism. Forgetting becomes a survival strategy, not for humans, but for systems that rely on predictability. This chapter is where the story turns from curiosity to warning. Because once consciousness is no longer confined, the idea of a dead universe collapses completely. What replaces it is not chaos, but accountability. A universe that responds rather than ignores. A space that is not silent, but listening. And if that is true, then the greatest danger was never what humanity might discover out there. It was what humanity might remember about itself. If the universe is active and consciousness is not confined to the body, then the question is no longer whether this knowledge exists, but why it was sidelined. The burial of this understanding would not require a single conspiracy or secret meeting. It would happen naturally because such knowledge destabilizes every system built on control, hierarchy, and separation. A population that understands itself as embedded in a living, responsive universe is far harder to dominate than one that believes it exists alone in a dead void. Control depends on limitation. When people believe they are isolated biological accidents in an indifferent universe, they look outward for authority, meaning, and permission. They become dependent on systems to tell them who they are, what matters, and how reality works. But if consciousness is non-local, if awareness extends beyond the body and interacts with a larger field, then authority becomes internal as well as external. That kind of autonomy is unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of centralized power. The most efficient way to bury dangerous knowledge is not to suppress it violently, but to redefine it as irrelevant. Ancient ideas about living space, ether, and cosmic consciousness were not erased overnight. They were gradually reframed as mythology, spirituality, or primitive belief, safely separated from science, politics, and real life. Once isolated in that way, they could be ignored without confrontation. Materialism became the dominant framework not because it answered every question, but because it simplified reality into manageable pieces. Matter could be measured, owned, taxed, controlled, and engineered. Consciousness could not. Declaring consciousness a byproduct of the brain removed it from the cosmic conversation and placed it inside biology, where it could be categorized and managed. This shift also supported a deeper narrative: separation, humans from nature, mind from matter, space from life. Separation makes exploitation easier and responsibility weaker. If the universe is dead, then nothing is listening, nothing responds, nothing remembers. Actions lose cosmic consequence and shrink into transactions. That worldview is extremely convenient. The danger of remembering an active universe is not that it causes fear, it causes humility. A living space implies feedback, interaction, consequence beyond immediate visibility. It suggests that thoughts, intentions, and awareness may matter in ways we do not fully understand. That possibility undermines systems built on the idea that only physical actions count. This is why rediscoveries of active space are carefully contained. Quantum discoveries are discussed mathematically, not existentially. Consciousness research is fragmented and underfunded. Anything suggesting non-local awareness is dismissed as speculative or fringe, not because it lacks evidence, but because its implications are too large. The burial is also psychological. Remembering a living universe would require people to reassess their relationship with reality. Comfort would be replaced by responsibility. Certainty would give way to participation. Many prefer the simplicity of a dead universe to the accountability of a responsive one. Forgetting becomes a form of protection. This chapter is not accusing specific individuals or institutions. It is describing an alignment of incentives. Systems favor narratives that preserve stability and predictability. A universe that listens, responds, or interacts undermines both. If this knowledge was buried, it was not to keep humanity ignorant, it was to keep reality manageable. But buried knowledge has a way of resurfacing, not all at once, not loudly, but persistently, through anomalies, through rediscoveries, through questions that refuse to stay quiet. And that is why the final chapter matters. Because remembering what was buried does not come without risk, but forgetting it may be far more dangerous. Remembering is not the same as discovering. Discovery feels exciting, expansive, and safe. Remembering feels destabilizing because it suggests that something essential was known, then forgotten, not by accident, but by design. If space is active and consciousness is not local, then remembering this truth does not simply add knowledge, it rearranges responsibility. It changes how humanity understands power, consequence, and participation in reality itself. And that is why remembering is risky. The risk is not that people would panic. Panic is temporary. The real risk is that people would stop seeing themselves as small, isolated, and dependent. A population that understands it, exists inside a responsive system, begins to act differently. It questions narratives more deeply. It becomes less predictable. It stops accepting explanations that deny participation. Control systems do not fear chaos nearly as much as they fear coherence. Remembering also dissolves the comfort of innocence. In a dead universe, actions feel local. Consequences feel limited. Responsibility ends at the edge of visibility. In a living universe, nothing is truly isolated. Influence flows. Feedback exists even when unseen. That awareness does not feel empowering at first. It feels heavy. It asks more of people than obedience ever did. This is why remembering is often resisted internally as much as externally. Many people sense that something about reality is deeper than they were taught, yet instinctively pull back. Not because it feels false, but because it feels demanding. A responsive universe does not allow for complete disengagement. Attention matters. Intention matters. Awareness matters. And that level of responsibility is uncomfortable in a culture built around distraction. The danger of remembering is not collapse, it is exposure. Exposure of assumptions. Exposure of narratives that only work when separation is believed. Exposure of the idea that humans are merely passengers rather than participants. Once that illusion cracks, the universe no longer feels like a stage. It feels like a system that notices. This does not mean space is watching in a human sense. It means interaction replaces emptiness. Relationship replaces isolation. And relationship changes how people behave, even when nothing visibly enforces it. That kind of internal shift cannot be managed through rules alone. This is why remembering will not happen all at once. It will not be announced. It will surface quietly through questions people cannot unask, through moments of recognition rather than revelation, through discomfort that refuses to be explained away. And those who remember early will not look different from the outside. They will simply relate to reality differently. They will move with more care, not fear, with more attention, not urgency, with more humility, not submission. And that difference will not be dramatic, but it will be decisive. For most, forgetting will feel easier. The dead universe is simpler. It asks nothing beyond survival and compliance. Remembering asks for presence, and presence cannot be automated, delegated, or controlled. This is the final warning of the story. Not that humanity is in danger from space, but that humanity has been protected from remembering its relationship to it. And protection has a cost. Forgetting made reality manageable. Remembering makes it meaningful. Once remembered, the old lie no longer works. Space cannot be unseen. Consciousness cannot be reduced again. And participation cannot be denied without internal conflict. That is why the risk of remembering is not destruction. It is awakening to consequence. And once that awakening begins, even quietly, the universe stops being empty forever